The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, Nebraska, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of Main Street. Officer James Mitchell sat in his patrol car, sipping the last of his now-cold coffee. It had been a quiet Thursday evening, the kind where time seemed to crawl by at a snail's pace. He'd spent most of his shift doing routine patrols, waving at the locals who knew him by name in this tight-knit community of just over 5,000 people. As he cruised past Wilson's hardware store, a flash of movement caught his eye. A faded blue 1985 Ford pickup truck rolled through the intersection, its right taillight clearly broken. Mitchell straightened in his seat, placing his coffee cup in the holder. He'd seen this truck around town before, usually parked outside the VA hospital on the outskirts of Cedar Grove. With a practiced motion, he flipped on his patrol car's lights. The pickup truck responded immediately, pulling over to the curb with a smoothness that suggested its driver was no stranger to traffic stops. Mitchell noticed there was no hesitation, no sudden movements, just calm, deliberate actions. As he approached the vehicle, Mitchell observed the driver through the rear window. An elderly man sat perfectly still, both hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2 o'clock. He wore a worn military cap, its fabric faded but clean, with what looked like Marine Corps insignia barely visible in the growing darkness. "Good evening, sir," Mitchell said, touching the brim of his police cap. "Do you know why I pulled you over today?" The elderly man turned slowly, his weathered face catching the last rays of sunlight. His eyes, sharp and alert despite his age, met Mitchell's with an unwavering gaze. "Evening, officer. I reckon it's about the taillight. Been meaning to get that fixed, but the auto parts store's been waiting on a shipment." There was something in the man's voice, a quiet dignity, a hint of stories untold. Mitchell found himself nodding, already reaching for his notepad, more out of habit than necessity. The man's license and registration were ready before Mitchell could ask for them, handed over with steady hands that bore the calluses of someone who'd worked hard his entire life. "I'll need to run these through the system, mister." Mitchell glanced at the license. "Walker. Thomas Walker. I'll be right back." Walking back to his patrol car, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. There was something about Mr. Walker's demeanor, too composed, too practiced, like a man who'd faced far worse situations than a simple traffic violation. Sliding into his seat, Mitchell began entering Walker's information into his computer. The screen flickered to life, databases searching through decades of records. Then, something unexpected appeared. A warrant from 1982, nearly as old as Mitchell himself. Mitchell blinked, double-checking the information. In all his years on the force, he'd never seen a warrant quite this old. The details were sparse. Failure to appear in court, a misdemeanor charge related to a public disturbance. But what caught his attention was the date, July 4th, 1982. As he stepped out of his patrol car, Mitchell felt the weight of his duty pressing against his conscience. The law was clear about outstanding warrants, no matter how old. Yet something about this situation felt different. The fading daylight cast long shadows across the street as he approached Walker's truck again, his footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air. Little did he know, this routine traffic stop was about to become one of the most memorable moments of his career, and the story that would unfold would change not just his perspective, but the entire department's approach to handling veterans in their community. Officer Mitchell approached the truck again, his mind racing with questions about the decades-old warrant. The streetlights had flickered on, casting pools of yellow light across the scene. Inside the truck, Thomas Walker hadn't moved an inch, his hands still resting exactly where they'd been before. "Mr. Walker," Mitchell began, his voice professional but gentle. "There seems to be a situation we need to discuss. Could you please step out of the vehicle?" Walker nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. He opened the door carefully and stepped out with deliberate movements. Standing at full height, despite his age, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a military man. His worn jeans and flannel shirt were clean but faded, like everything else about him spoke of a life lived with dignity despite hardship. "There's an outstanding warrant for your arrest," Mitchell explained, watching Walker's face carefully for any reaction, "from 1982. Are you aware of this?" A flicker of something, not quite surprise, more like resigned recognition, crossed Walker's weathered features. July 4th, 1982, he said quietly. Some dates stick with you, officer. Some you can never forget. Mitchell's hand rested lightly on his handcuffs. Department policy was clear about outstanding warrants, no matter how old. Sir, I'm going to have to place you under arrest. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Walker complied without protest, moving with the same measured calm he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. As Mitchell began to apply the handcuffs, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a small POW/MIA pin on Walker's cap, which had fallen slightly askew. You know, Walker said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, last time I wore handcuffs was in '69. Different circumstances, different country. Wasn't police officers then, it was the Viet Cong. Mitchell's fingers froze on the handcuffs. The words hung in the cool evening air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across them, the driver probably wondering what old Tom Walker could have possibly done to be in this situation. The court date, Walker continued, still in that quiet, dignified voice, I meant to be there. But those were different times. Back then, we didn't talk about things like PTSD. Didn't even have a name for it. Just called it shell shock or combat stress. That 4th of July, the fireworks, he trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Mitchell felt the weight of his badge pressing against his chest. In the academy, they trained him for every possible situation, or so he'd thought. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, standing in the growing darkness with a Vietnam POW in handcuffs over a 40-year-old warrant. Through the open window of his patrol car, the radio crackled with routine chatter from dispatch. A dog barking in the distance and the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze were the only other sounds breaking the heavy silence. Mitchell looked at Walker's reflection in the truck's window, the straight spine, the squared shoulders, the quiet dignity even in custody, and knew this situation required more than just following standard procedure. This wasn't just another arrest. This was a moment that would test everything Mitchell believed about justice, duty, and compassion. As he stood there, one hand still on the handcuffs, the other resting uncertainly on his belt, Mitchell realized he was about to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. Mitchell's hand moved from the handcuffs to Walker's shoulder. Sir, would you mind telling me more about what happened? He gestured to his patrol car. We can sit inside, it's more comfortable than standing here. Walker nodded, his eyes distant as if already traveling back through time. As they settled into the patrol car, the soft hum of the heater created a cocoon of warmth against the growing chill of the evening. I was a helicopter pilot, Walker began, his voice steady but quiet. Flying Hueys for the Marines. March 15, 1969. That's when they shut us down. We were running a rescue mission near the Laotian border. He paused, running his weathered hands along his knees. Lost 2 good men that day. The rest of us, well, we spent the next 3 years as guests of the North Vietnamese. Mitchell sat silently, the blue glow of his dashboard computers casting shadows across their faces. The radio chatter seemed to fade into the background as Walker continued his story. 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. You count every single one when you're in there. Walker's fingers unconsciously traced a faded scar on his wrist where the handcuffs had been. When I came home in '72, everyone expected things to just go back to normal. But normal wasn't something I knew how to do anymore. A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the inside of the patrol car. Walker blinked, then continued. That 4th of July in '82, I was trying to get better. Really was. Had a job at the lumber yard, was making payments on the house. But when those fireworks started, he shook his head slowly. Suddenly, I wasn't in Nebraska anymore. I was back in that cage, listening to the artillery fire getting closer, never knowing if it was American shells coming to save us or enemy fire coming to end us. Mitchell found himself gripping his steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His own father had served, but he'd never talked about his experiences this way. I didn't hurt anyone, Walker said, his voice taking on a hint of pride, despite the pain in his words. Just broke some windows at the hardware store, trying to get away from sounds that weren't really there. Owner didn't even want to press charges. He'd served in Korea, understood what was happening. But the system had its procedures, and I had my court date. "Which you missed," Mitchell said softly, not as an accusation but as an understanding. "Checked myself into the VA hospital that morning. First time I admitted I needed help. Spent 6 weeks there, learning that what I was experiencing had a name, that I wasn't going crazy." Walker turned to look directly at Mitchell. "By the time I got out, that court date seemed like something from another life. Figured if they wanted me, they knew where to find me. I've been right here in Cedar Grove all these years, trying to help other vets avoid the same pitfalls." The patrol car fell silent except for the soft clicking of the engine cooling down. Through the windshield, they could see the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Mitchell thought about the warrant in his computer, about the regulations and procedures he was supposed to follow, and about the man sitting next to him who had already served his country far more than most could understand. "You know," Walker added, almost as an afterthought, "these days I run a support group at the VA. Every Tuesday and Thursday. Help the young ones coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. Try to show them there's no shame in asking for help, that they don't have to wait 10 years like I did." His voice carried a mixture of regret and hope. "Sometimes the best thing we can do with our scars is use them to help others heal." As the night settled around them, Walker's story flowed more freely. His hands moved as he spoke, sketching invisible maps in the air of places half a world away and half a lifetime ago. "We were running rescue ops that day," he continued, his eyes focused on something distant. "Got word that an army unit was pinned down in a hot zone. Bad weather, heavy fire, but those boys needed help. You don't think twice about the risks when other soldiers need you." He described the mission with the clarity of someone who'd replayed it countless times in his mind. "We were about 5 minutes from the pickup zone when they hit us. Anti-aircraft fire, never saw it coming through the clouds. Lost our tail rotor first, then the engine started smoking. You train for emergencies, but nothing prepares you for that moment when you're actually falling out of the sky." Mitchell listened intently, noticing how Walker's right hand unconsciously gripped his left shoulder, likely an old injury from the crash. The veteran's voice remained steady, but his knuckles were white. "The crash wasn't the worst part. It was what came after. 3 of us survived the initial impact. They found us within hours." Walker paused, taking a deep breath. "The prison camp. Well, let's just say it makes these handcuffs feel like jewelry." He managed a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We were moved between 3 different camps over those 3 years. The worst was a place we called the Maze. Underground cells, complete darkness most of the time. But we kept each other going. Had a code, tap on the walls to communicate. 1 tap for hang on, 2 for stay strong, 3 for don't give up." Walker rolled up his sleeve, revealing a simple tattoo on his forearm, 3 small dots in a line. "Got this after I came home. Reminder of those taps, of the men who helped me survive. Some of them never made it back." He spoke about the rescue, how a joint special forces operation finally found their camp in '72. "Heard the helicopters coming before dawn. Same sound I used to make, coming to save others. Funny how life works sometimes, the rescuer becoming the rescued." The return home should have been triumphant, but Walker's voice grew softer as he described it. "Everyone wanted to celebrate, but I'd forgotten how. Crowds made me nervous. Loud noises sent me diving for cover. Tried to go back to my old job at the bank, but couldn't handle being inside all day, felt too much like being in that cell. The lumberyard job helped, being outside, working with my hands. But the 4th of July, he shook his head. Those fireworks that night in '82, they weren't just fireworks to me. Each boom was anti-aircraft fire. Each flash was the explosion that took down my Huey. Next thing I knew, I was through the hardware store window, trying to find cover from an enemy that wasn't there." Mitchell noticed how Walker's hands had stopped shaking as he spoke. Sometimes, he realized, the simple act of telling your story could be its own kind of therapy. "You know what saved me?" Walker asked, turning to face Mitchell directly. "The VA hospital staff, sure, but more than that, it was finding purpose again. Started talking to other vets who were struggling. Turned out my story helped them open up about their own battles. Now I've got guys from Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, all sitting in the same room, all understanding each other in ways nobody else can." Officer Mitchell sat quietly in his patrol car, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. Walker's story had struck a deeply personal chord. He couldn't help but think of his own father, who'd served in Desert Storm and came back a different man. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247. Mitchell finally spoke into his radio, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. He glanced at Walker, who sat calmly beside him, still wearing the handcuffs with quiet dignity. "Go ahead, 247, the dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. Mitchell paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I've got a situation here that needs some guidance. Can you patch me through to Sergeant Thompson?" While waiting for a response, Mitchell's mind wandered to a conversation he'd had with his father years ago. It was late one night, after his dad had finally opened up about his war experiences. Sometimes, his father had said, doing the right thing isn't the same as following the rulebook. The radio crackled again. "Mitchell, this is Thompson. What's your situation?" "Sergeant, I've got a 40-year-old warrant here. Subject is a Vietnam vet, POW survivor. The warrant's from a PTSD incident back in '82. Subject's been living openly in town, running veteran support groups at the VA." There was a long pause on the other end. The only sound in the car was the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of crickets through the slightly open window. "What's your read on the situation, officer?" Thompson's voice was measured, professional. Mitchell looked at Walker, saw the quiet strength in the old veteran's eyes, the same kind of strength he'd seen in his father's. "Sir, I'm looking at a man who's already served his time in ways most of us can't imagine. He spent the last 40 years helping other vets cope with their own battles. The warrant stems from a PTSD episode during fireworks. The store owner never even wanted to press charges." Through the windshield, Mitchell could see kids riding their bikes under the streetlights, enjoying the last bit of evening freedom. He thought about the kind of community they lived in, the kind of justice they should stand for. "The thing is, Sergeant," Mitchell continued, his voice growing more confident, "this man's doing more good for our veterans right now than any arrest could serve. He's got a support group meeting tomorrow morning at the VA. There are probably guys counting on him being there." Walker turned to look at Mitchell, surprise flickering across his weathered features. It was probably the first time in 40 years someone had spoken up for him like this. The radio silence stretched out, each second feeling longer than the last. Mitchell's career could hinge on how this played out, but somehow that seemed less important than doing what was right. Finally, Thompson's voice came through, carrying decades of law enforcement experience in its tone. "Sometimes, Mitchell, our job is about more than just enforcing the law. It's about serving the community. What's your suggestion for handling this?" With Thompson's words hanging in the air, Mitchell made a decision. He stepped out of the patrol car and opened the back door. "Mr. Walker, I'd like to see this support group of yours, if that's okay." Walker's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "We meet at 800 tomorrow. Military time's a habit none of us broke." Mitchell removed the handcuffs, watching as Walker rubbed his wrists, not with relief, but with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all evening. "Tell me about these veterans you work with," Mitchell said, leading Walker to a nearby bench under a streetlight. "Each one's got their own battle," Walker began, settling onto the bench. "Got a young Marine back from Afghanistan, couldn't sleep for months because the sound of cars backfiring reminded him of IEDs. Now he's back in college, studying psychology to help others like him." The streetlight cast a warm glow as Walker continued. "There's an old Desert Storm tank commander who lost his whole crew, blamed himself for years. Started coming to meetings 3 years ago, barely said a word. Now he's one of our strongest voices, helps new members open up." Walker pulled out a worn leather wallet, carefully removing a folded photograph. This was last year's Christmas gathering. The photo showed about 20 veterans of different ages, all smiling, some with arms around each other's shoulders. When they first come in, they can't even sit with their backs to the door. But together, they find their way back. Mitchell studied the photo, noting how Walker stood in the background, his presence subtle but essential. "How many veterans have you helped over the years?" "Lost count somewhere after 500, Walker replied, his voice humble. "But it's not about numbers. It's about each individual finding their way home, really home, not just physically. See that young man there?" He pointed to someone in the photo. "He was ready to end it all when his wife brought him in. Now he's got a new baby, runs his own business. Sometimes all they need is someone who understands without judging. Walker described their weekly meetings, the coffee that's always brewing, the chairs arranged in a circle so everyone can see each other, the unspoken understanding when someone needs to step out for a moment. We don't just talk about the bad stuff, he explained. We celebrate victories too. First full night's sleep, first time back in a crowd, first 4th of July without diving for cover. As he spoke, a small smile crossed his face. Last month, one of our newer members, Army Rangers, 2 tours in Iraq. He called me at 3 a.m. Said he was having thoughts he couldn't handle. I talked with him until sunrise, then drove him to the VA myself. Yesterday, he brought in cookies his daughter baked to thank the group. Said it was the first time he'd felt peace in years. Mitchell listened, understanding now why Walker had remained in Cedar Grove all these years. He wasn't just helping veterans cope, he was helping them rebuild their lives, one day at a time. You know what the hardest part is? Walker asked, carefully returning the photo to his wallet. Watching them struggle with the same demons I fought. But that's also what helps them trust me. When I tell them it gets better, they believe me because they know I've walked that road. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the county courthouse as Officer Mitchell and Thomas Walker stood before Judge Wilson. The old courtroom was quiet except for the gentle whirring of ceiling fans and the occasional creak of wooden benches. 40 years is a long time, Judge Wilson said, reviewing the paperwork on his desk. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he looked up at Walker. Why come forward now? Your Honor, Mr. Walker didn't come forward, Mitchell stepped in. I pulled him over for a broken taillight. But what I discovered was something our community needs more than an arrest. Mitchell described the previous night's events, Walker's decades of service to fellow veterans, and the lives he'd helped transform. As he spoke, the courtroom door quietly opened. Several people slipped in, taking seats in the back, veterans from Walker's support group, some still wearing their work uniforms, others in pressed suits. The warrant stems from a PTSD episode during a time when we barely understood what PTSD was, Mitchell continued. Since then, Mr. Walker has dedicated his life to preventing similar incidents, helping hundreds of veterans transition back to civilian life. The judge listened intently, his eyes moving between Mitchell and Walker. Mr. Walker, do you have anything to add? Walker stood straighter, his voice clear and steady. Only that I'm sorry I didn't face this sooner, Your Honor. I've spent 40 years trying to make up for that night, trying to help others find their way back from their own dark places. Judge Wilson removed his reading glasses, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. The room held its breath. Finally, he spoke. The purpose of our legal system isn't just punishment, it's justice and community welfare. Mr. Walker, it seems you've done more to serve both those goals through your work than any sentence could achieve. With a decisive tap of his gavel, the judge dismissed the warrant. The veterans in the back of the courtroom stood, their faces showing relief and respect. One young man in a mechanic's uniform wiped his eyes quickly. But the story didn't end there. A week later, Mitchell presented a proposal to the police department, a new protocol for handling veterans in crisis. Walker would help train officers to recognize PTSD symptoms and respond appropriately. The broken taillight that started it all, fixed for free by one of the veterans from the support group, a local mechanic who'd found his healing in helping others. The following 4th of July, something remarkable happened. The town organized a quiet fireworks display, all the colors, minimal noise, with a special viewing area for veterans. Walker was there, surrounded by his support group members and their families. Officer Mitchell stopped by, now a regular visitor to the VA meetings. You know, Walker said to Mitchell as they watched the silent bursts of color paint the sky, sometimes the longest journey isn't the one that takes you halfway around the world. It's the one that brings you back home. Mitchell nodded, understanding now that law enforcement wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about serving people. That night, watching the quiet fireworks with men and women who'd given so much for their country, he realized that sometimes the best way to uphold justice is to recognize when healing matters more than punishment. The story of the traffic stop that changed everything became part of police training in Cedar Grove. It reminded every new officer that behind every encounter there might be a story worth hearing, a person worth understanding, and an opportunity to make their community stronger.